started. So first off, thank you all so much for joining us. It's great to have you here. If you don't know me, I'm Jeff Way, the manager of publishing futures for ACMRS. So first, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I know it's been a very long semester for all of us, so I appreciate you all joining us when our energy is flagging for what I think is going to be a great conversation. And thank you again to all of you who have joined us throughout the fall for our various events. We're also excited about our spring lineup of events, and I'll hope you join us next semester, beginning with our next Race Before Race conference on education in January. The Race Before Race education program is now online and registration is available through our website. And also be sure to sign up for our mailing list to get updates on our full spring event schedule at acmrs.asu.edu/about if you haven't already done so. Also, if you'd like to help in supporting more events like these, please consider going to acmrs.asu.edu/give to make a donation if you're able to do so. So real quick before introducing today's speaker, I want to talk briefly about the ACMRS short-term residency program. So as part of our mission, the ACMRS short-term residencies are designed to be as inclusive as possible and allow for maximum flexibility. These residencies offer scholars the opportunity to focus on finishing projects for publication over a 4 to 6 week period, with the option to divide the residency into shorter segments throughout the year or conduct a portion of the residency remotely, or entirely remotely if we're in a pandemic. By providing an inclusive and flexible opportunity accessible to scholars from a wide range of disciplines, these residencies are one of the ways we're continuing to work at ACMRS to promote the most expansive, creative, and daring scholarship in medieval and Renaissance studies. For those interested, we're now accepting applications for the short-term residency for the 21-22 academic year, and you can find more information on our website, and the deadline for applying for that is March 1st, 2021. As always, today's event is going to be live captioned. If you want to take advantage of that, just click on the CC button on the bottom of your screen. We also have the chat open for today's event, so we welcome conversation, but just ask that everyone is respectful and collegial in the chat. And we, of course, also encourage live tweeting today's event using the ACMRS events hashtag. Now, I'm excited to introduce today's speaker, ACMRS short-term resident, Gabriel de Avilez Rocha. As always, I won't spend time reading Gabriel's bio today, but you can find it on our website. I do want to say I'm personally very excited for today's talk. Gabriel's work focuses on the social and environmental histories of colonialism and slavery in the early Atlantic world. And his talk today, titled Runaway Ecologies, considers some key questions around this. How might the historic role of fugitive collectives appear in a different light if we consider the ways in which runaways play a part in shaping contact-era island environments? More broadly, how does weighing the impact of initiatives of escape from enslavement on both sides of the Atlantic at an early critical juncture of colonization alter our understanding of the relationship between empire, insurgency, and nature? I'll now turn things over to Gabriel. His talk will be around 30 minutes, and then we'll open things up for a Q&A and discussion with everyone in the second half of an event. So take it away, Gabriel.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. I know we're a little zoomed out as the term draws to a close, so I really appreciate having folks tune in. I know that there will be other opportunities, hopefully, for us to exchange ideas and connect. But I am really excited to be here with you all, even if virtually. I also want to give a really big thank you to Jeff Way and Leah Newsom and the folks who made this all happen really seamlessly, despite having to shift plans, throughout because of the extraordinary circumstances of the pandemic. And I want to thank really Ayanna Thompson for having the vision of putting this flexible residency program together, even before circumstances demanded maximum flexibility. I think it's a program that is rightfully, I think, should be a model for research institutions, especially for those of us who have caretaking responsibilities on the home front, and for whom inflexible residencies are not really possible. So I really want to express my gratitude for the support of ACMRS in helping me advance my book project. And so my talk today is based directly on the work that I've completed during my residency. I'm going to be sharing my screen in just a second here so you all can see some pictures. and texts. Let's see here. Okay. Oh, hang on. I did not share my screen. I just opened my PowerPoint. Okay. This is the regular Zoom things that happen. Okay. All right. So you should all be able to see the slideshow here. So today I'll be asking us to think about a multitude of struggles put forward by people in the early Atlantic world who sought to escape from conditions of enslavement and dispossession. Like many other historians, I draw from a rich, albeit far from straightforward set of manuscript records from Portuguese and Spanish colonial archives, and ask what they might offer us in the task of analyzing, imagining, and narrating histories of empire, nature, and insurgency in the late medieval and early modern world. The sources I'll draw from come from a particular historical moment between the late 15th and early 16th centuries that give us glimpses of fugitive women and men across different geographies, from the island of São Tomé, a Portuguese colony in West Africa's Gulf of Guinea, to many islands on the other side of the ocean, the Greater Antilles in the early Spanish Caribbean. And here, just to get us started, I want to show a map that's held at the Huntington Library in the Vallarta Atlas from 1547 that kind of gives us a sense of 16th century conceptualizations of the broad geographies that we'll be covering in the course of my talk. Here, the orientation is not what you might expect. South is up, north is down. On the left side of my screen, here, is the coast of West Central Africa with the Congo River here. And on the right side of the screen, you see the eastern seaboard of South America. Of course, the São Tomé Island, which I'll be talking about, is found here on the lower left-hand corner of the map. And the Caribbean, of course, is slightly off screen, but depending on your definition of the Greater Caribbean, right, you can see the northeastern parts of South America there. So while we'll be looking closely at separate and unique contexts of early colonial marinage in discrete corners of the Atlantic world, I'll also hope to underscore a series of historical linkages between them. I'll be arguing, in fact, for seeing the formation of the Spanish and Portuguese Atlantic imperial systems as being influenced in part from the cumulative weight of marinage. And for those who aren't familiar, marinage is the term that's used in English and French for enterprises of escape enacted by people who are often referred to as maroons. Marinage and maroons, in the historical moment I'll be examining, not only inaugurated traditions of insurgency, but played a role in inflecting and shaping emergent colonial discourses and practices of domination vis-a-vis nature and people that are still with us today. By way of starting, I want to flag a few scholars whose work has been helpful in offering me an interdisciplinary framework through which to approach archival sources relating to marinage in early colonial history. I take to heart insights put forward by Abdias Nascimento and Carol Boyce Davies, who call for broadening traditionally circumscribed or rigid definitions of marinage and invite us to think historically about individual and collective emancipatory enterprises spearheaded by runaways in ways that are spatially and temporally expansive. So rather than situating the realm of fugitivity as elsewhere to colonial society, these scholars, in conjunction with geographers of the Black diaspora like Catherine McKittrick and Judith Carney, can help us cast marinage as a praxis of liberation with considerable historical and spatial depth. More recently, the archaeologist Adela Amaral, who studies historical maroon communities in Mexico, puts it really well, I think, when she writes that a palenque, which is a term used in the Spanish Caribbean to refer to fugitive settlements, was a geographically disarticulated place, both bordered and borderless, as it was composed of socially and politically connected segments, each with decipherable spatial limits and practices, though they were not geographically contiguous. So bringing these considerations to bear on the environmental dimensions of marronage also allows us to try and ground fugitivity in the dynamic material realities that constitute the web of greater than human life. Doing so suggests we revisit key concepts in environmental historiography, among them Alfred Crosby's paradigm of the Colombian exchange. First formulated in the 1970s, this framework of analysis has drawn attention to how newly introduced plants, animals, and pathogens caused sweeping ecological transformations with disastrous consequences for native peoples and their societies. While the Colombian exchange concept allows for reciprocity, right, American crops like maize and manioc adopted in Africa and Europe, for instance, it also advances from the view that Europeans derived most power from ecological transformation. Yet colonial environmental historians seldom center the struggles of Maroons in their accounts of contact era history, despite what we know of fugitives who crafted autonomous arenas of mobility, often characterized as naturally inaccessible and wild by colonists. Situating Maroons in relation to contact era environmental change helps us move beyond existing blind spots in environmental historiography and recasts how we might narrate colonial environmental history through a concept that I'll be calling runaway ecologies. By runaway ecologies, I mean the social and environmental processes in and through which fugitives from enslavement and dispossession contended with colonial contact era material transformations as they aim to secure and or fortify their means of autonomy and means of liberation. So to outline how a social and environmental history of marronage can make clear some of these lasting consequences, let's begin in São Tomé. Situated in West Africa's Gulf of Guinea, the island, which is today part of the nation state of São Tomé and Príncipe, lies roughly 600 miles northwest of the Congo River Delta and spans an area of 330 square miles, forming part of an archipelago shaped by past volcanic activity. Portuguese mariners who first arrived on the island in the 1470s allegedly found no human inhabitants there, encountering instead a series of soaring peaks and ravines covered by a very thick forest, as an early 16th century navigator put it. And here you have a rendition of the island that appears in an atlas by Valentim Fernandes, a German-Portuguese geographer in the early 16th century. And you can see in the center of the island there a representation of the topography and the especially marked elevation of the peaks towards the center of the island. Now, given the vibrant maritime traditions across West and West Central Africa, the obscure nature of European sources attesting to the first arrivals of Portuguese mariners on the island, and the complete lack of archaeological work conducted on the island to date, one would do well to approach characterizations of São Tomé as uninhabited prior to Portuguese settlement and of its ecologies as pristine with some ambivalence. In any case, late 15th century Portuguese-speaking residents of São Tomé came to refer to the island's wooded realms as matos, which could be translated as wilds or bush. And I'll be keeping the word in Portuguese throughout my remarks here. So for instance, one settler remembered in 1499 that in earlier years of dearth, he and his companions survived by foraging and hunting in the matos of the island. Establishing their main settlements on the northeastern coast, colonists from the beginning were active participants in the Atlantic slave trade, purchasing and selling large numbers of women, men, and children transported through dynamic African trading networks that extended from the Niger and Congo River deltas. The first waves of Africans brought into bondage to São Tomé were conscripted into exploitative domestic labor arrangements, as well as in the backbreaking work of clearing the matos, cultivating subsistence crops like yam, and raising livestock newly introduced to the island. Others still were held in bondage on the island temporarily prior to being transported once more to the Portuguese trading post in Mina, present-day Ghana, other Atlantic islands, or to major ports in Portugal and Andalusia. And here you have another 16th century map this is a Portuguese one, and you see the island in this part here. Sorry, my screen is in the way. And a rendition of the Portuguese trading post, the castle at Mina, which was situated here on the coast. And just to give you a sort of orientation regionally of the trading networks that São Tomé was situated in. Now, despite formidable obstacles, many enslaved people managed to escape from their conditions of bondage to the matos and even the sea as early as the 1490s. The spaces known to the Portuguese as matos were, however, likely in the process of great transformation during this late 15th century moment. Contributing to the many cascading changes underway were the introduction of domesticated animals brought by colonists from Iberia and colonial settlements on other Atlantic islands, chief among them hogs. Omnivorous creatures par excellence, hogs have the ability to subsist in a variety of environments, including tropical rainforests and sugarcane habitats. Biogeographers confirm that when introduced into environments in which there are relatively few apex predators, as was the case in 15th century São Tomé, hogs multiply exponentially at a galloping pace. Using their considerable wits, they're difficult to keep enclosed in large numbers. Left to their own devices, they quickly undergo the biological transformations such as growing tusks and gaining heft that we today understand as the process of going feral, but that late medieval Iberians identified as bravo, an adjective that can be translated as wild. Feeding primarily on small plants and shoots, seedlings, and subterranean creatures, for which the island was particularly abundant, feral hogs in the 1480s and 90s thrived both in the mato and near to coastal enclaves cultivated by settlers. The proliferation of feral creatures were part and parcel of transformations in the island ecology that can be seen as integral to the establishment of runaway ecologies in those years and decades to come. Already in 1490, Crown authorities in Lisbon recognized that the prevalence of feral creatures had the potential to destabilize the environmental and social conditions that made Portuguese rule viable on São Tomé, and potentially abetting escapes by the enslaved. In a charter naming João Pereira governor of São Tomé that year, administrators inserted a directive granting all inhabitants of the island the right to hunt for feral livestock found in any area of the island that had not been enclosed. This is a highly unusual measure for comparable documents in Portugal, and one that had been absent from donations to São Tomé's governors as recently as 4 years earlier. Clearly, if new social and environmental realities on the island were substantially different enough from previous years to prompt changes in relatively abstract governance documents, it's safe to assume that transformations on the ground were even more apparent. These transformations would become all the more evident by the 1520s, when colonial and metropolitan elites increasingly invested in the establishment of sugar plantations on São Tomé, as well as the expansion of the slave trade in the Gulf of Guinea and beyond, both to Europe and, as we'll get to in a minute, to the Caribbean. It's precisely at this moment that we find a significant increase in the number of fugitives from enslavement on São Tomé, perceived by Portuguese administrators and merchants to be building veritable bases of insurgency in the mato. A crown official on the island wrote to Lisbon in 1530, for instance, that escapes from coastal plantations were commonplace, especially on the eve of the departure of transatlantic slaving voyages. Prior to these years, he contended, runaways didn't yet know what it was to escape as they do now and as they increasingly know. So what did it mean to increasingly know how to run away? Clearly, the ecological dynamism of the mato, evident to Lisbon officials since the 1490s, offered sources of sustenance that allowed many different individuals and groups the possibility of withdrawing from their conditions of bondage and creating new alliances and potentially new enmities. A constellation of documents points to several different fugitive collectives based mostly in the southern and western parts of the island as early as the 1520s. One of them led by an individual known to the Portuguese as Mocambo. And here I'll show you a document, one of the earliest that I found that makes a reference to Mocambo as the leader of a fugitive group that's situated in this space referred to as Mato. An important side note here, Mocambo is a term common to several Bantu languages spoken in West Central Africa, including Kikongo and Kimbundu, where the term ranges in meaning from ridge to hideaway. Now, approaching these terrains of differing altitudes and microclimates, the so-called people of Mocambo, among others, adapted a range of pre-existing subsistence practices to new conditions. This would have involved incorporating and accumulating new expertise around foraging, cultivating, and harvesting plants, fruits, and vegetables, and in all likelihood, devising methods for hunting feral hogs and other native and introduced species. The urgency of their quest for a reliable means of subsistence would have been not only required due to their conditions as fugitives, but also because of what appears to have been a serious provisioning crisis for the main Portuguese colonial settlements in the early 1530s. Much of the colonial correspondence in those years offered this provisioning crisis as an explanation for why so many people chose escape in the first place. Although, of course, there would have been a wider range of motives, this linkage in the colonial archive between the dearth of subsistence available to people under conditions of enslavement and the escalation of fugitive struggles is important and something that I'll return to towards the end of the talk. Now, for a lengthy span of years into the 1530s and beyond, these fugitives regularly attacked settler farmsteads for provisions and new recruits. Despite colonial administrators' association of the Mato as an arena of fugitivity, many witnesses noted that the people connected to Mocambo also built watercrafts, likely to ease mobility along river and coastal routes on the island, but perhaps also to engage in regional movements to other islands or coastal locations on the continent. Many fugitives followed what might seem circuitous paths, escaping on the eve of the departure of slaving voyages to the Caribbean, for instance, and returning once the threat of exile had subsided, leading an existence that went back and forth between their sites of enslavement and the so-called Mato. The non-linear and amphibious trajectories of fugitives mobilized through runaway ecologies existed in constant tension with colonial characterizations of the realm of runaways as strictly circumscribed to the Mato. Nevertheless, the power accumulated by fugitive communities in São Tomé did not simply alter colonial understandings of the island's geopolitics or the economic situation on the island. It prompted an administrative response with deep consequences for the consolidation of the Portuguese and ultimately Spanish imperial systems in the Atlantic world. Assessing the growth of fugitive struggles, colonists, officials, and merchants knew that they could not stop patterns of escape, let alone dominate the Mato. And some of their comments in correspondence or in depositions of the time admit as such. So instead, they mounted a series of counterinsurgency campaigns aiming to re-enslave fugitives, engaging in a larger conflict that became known as the Guerra do Mato, the War of the Mato. To coordinate their efforts, Crown administrators in 1533 created even the position of a treasurer for the said War of the Mato, entrusting the person filling this role to coordinate efforts with royal and local administrators in the collection and distribution of supplies and funds for militia expeditions. These entailed significant investments in time and money to recruit salaried mercenary soldiers, some of them brought from Europe, but the majority of them recruited locally, and including, I should add, free people of color and enslaved people. They also, this treasurer also distributed bounties to those who captured and returned escaped individuals alive to authorities. Now, to Lisbon's merchant elite investing in slavery on São Tomé and to the colonial establishment on the island, counterinsurgency measures became a cost of business, akin to investing in the infrastructure of sugar mills and paying salaries for mariners or procuring merchandise exchanged for enslaved Africans from continental trading partners. But to fugitives themselves, the stakes for the outcome of these expeditions were unimaginably high. One colonial expedition in October of 1533, led by an individual known as Calixto de Arriaga and made up of at least 6 enslaved people, returned to the island's main town that month with 2 fugitives from the Mato who went unnamed in the records and whom they claimed to have apprehended near the east coast of the island. One of the runaways taken by Arriaga's retinue, according to a notary, was known to have previously escaped from their enslavers. Only a few days later, another individual named Baltazar Luis handed over to authorities a woman whom he claimed had been in flight near another location on the island known as Almagra Cove. For this, he received the modest sum of 500 reis. Authorities called on the captors of these 3 recaptured runaways to deliver them to the captain of the vessel São Miguel, awaiting at the time in the harbor to depart for Lisbon, carrying nearly 100 other people in bondage. Fugitives from different parts of the island, therefore, were rushed not only back into a status of enslavement, but into the trauma of renewed exile that they had sought so clearly to avoid by running away, at least for one of them multiple times. But the War of the Mato did not result in the full disbanding of fugitive settlements on São Tomé. Fugitive communities continued to draw sustenance from runaway ecologies, and despite setbacks and their shifting compositions, continuously occupied large swaths of the island in the 1530s and beyond. Their persistence likely gave rise to an ethnic group on São Tomé that later became known as the Angolares. And now this is its own fascinating story that scholars of São Tomé have explored in great detail. But rather than tracing this historical arc, I want to highlight the importance of patterns of fugitivity in São Tomé in this early 16th century moment in relation to similar, albeit discrete, runaway ecologies unfolding in the Caribbean in the same decades. So now we move to the other side of the ocean in an early 16th century moment where the initial social and ecological fallout from the invasions of Spanish and other Europeans in the ancestral islands and homelands of the Taino peoples and other native Caribbean collectives was still very much unfolding. Through patterns of dispossession and regional and transatlantic enslavement, colonial and metropolitan authorities founded a regime in the Caribbean based on plunder, extraction, and increasingly in the 1520s, the mass production of agricultural commodities like sugar, and of particular importance for the island's runaway ecologies, the expansion of ranching through open range grazing. This meant the proliferation of feral cattle. Now, historians have insufficiently noted that the intensification of fugitive struggles in the Matos of São Tomé in the 1520s and 30s were contemporaneous with well-known insurgencies on the greater Antillean island that came to be known by Europeans as Hispaniola, today shared between the nation states of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. One of the major insurrections during this time was led by the Taino cacique known to the Spanish as Enriquillo. Taino and African fugitives joined forces with Enriquillo in the 1520s in helping to establish and maintain a stronghold in the Bauruco Mountains in the south central region of the island, a region that corresponded with Enriquillo's ancestral Casigasco. They became known as cimarrones, a term with Taino language origins that serves as the basis of the English term maroon. And here there's a Spanish document with one of the earliest references to using the term cimarron, specifically in relation to Enriquillo's collective. Though their arenas of mobility extended beyond Bauruco, Spanish colonists frequently located them in the spaces that they called the monte, a comparable term to contemporaneous Portuguese constructions of the mato, a space of opaque, unruly ecologies, echoing the colonial authorities in São Tomé who portrayed arenas of indomitable nature conducive to harboring fugitives from enslavement. Likewise, the counterinsurgency measures taken by the Spanish in those years to respond to the emergence of Enriquillo's insurgency bears striking similarities with contemporaneous developments on São Tomé. From as early as 1525, the Cabildo and Audiencia of Santo Domingo appropriated funds from local residents through taxes on everyday expenses towards outfitting recurrent expeditions with paid recruits comprised of local residents, including enslaved people. Over the larger part of the 1520s, these recurrent campaigns, seen as part of a larger war of Bauruco, as is referred to in the documents, were expensive and largely unsuccessful at so much as locating Enrique's settlement. In fact, the first expedition to make contact with Bauruco did so only in 1528, noting that the settlement consisted of about 400 residents and had been, quote, almost impossible to find. In communications with Santo Domingo, the lead expeditioner reported that Bauruco's main settlement was, quote, lodged in a monte. Others noted that Maroons resided in veritable, quote, fortresses made by nature. Authorities on Santo Domingo in 1528 appear to have been particularly eager to broker a truce with the fugitives at Bauruco, receiving pressure from merchants and the crown to scale back some of the taxes levied on residents of Santo Domingo in order to finance the counterinsurgency campaigns. As a lawyer for the Audiencia wryly put it in correspondence to Madrid around this time, quote, the war of Bauruco has been a hindrance for business. Negotiators offered Enriquillo the terms of a truce that he and his followers would live in complete liberty with their own sheep and pigs, courtesy of the Spanish crown, on the condition that they remain in those mountains and woodlands, conduct peaceful trade with colonists, refrain from attacking Spanish settlements, and, in what would become a staple of future agreements between fugitive collectives and colonial authorities across Latin America, agree to recapture future runaways. Likely recognizing his position of strength in relation to shifting power balance on the island and in the region, Enriquillo refused at that time. His rebuffing of Spanish overtures in 1528 suggests that internal provisioning, let alone political cohesion, was not a major item of concern for leaders of the Bauruco settlement nearly a decade after the reestablishment of their autonomy. The successful persistence of this fugitive collective would have been made possible in no small part due to the recovery of Taino agricultural practices, themselves a continuation of millennia-old pre-Arawak traditions, combined most likely with the incorporation of new subsistence practices occasioned by ships in runaway ecologies, and an influx of non-Taino fugitives, namely Africans and Afro-descendants, many of whom would have newly arrived on the island on trafficking vessels hailing from São Tomé. As with São Tomé, the Cimarrones of Hispaniola appropriated and shaped volatile environments of the island, and in doing so, derived autonomy and power from ongoing ecological transformations. And there are a series of zooarchaeological finds that consistently locate faunal remains, including of hogs, in Maroon settlement sites, including at Bauruco, but as in other islands of the Caribbean, including Jamaica and Cuba. Although these are for later periods, they speak to a longer tradition of insurgencies and runaway ecologies. Critically, when it comes to the insurgents of Bauruco in the early 16th century, their arena of mobility on the island was not circumscribed to spaces that were referred to as montes. Rather, it appears that these areas offered a base from which to launch attacks against the Spanish. Farmsteads, ranches, sugar plantations. And here you see a map of Hispaniola from the later 16th century that locates here on the bottom left-hand corner the site of Bauruco and refers to them as the place where the blacks are insurgents. And so this speaks to the longer legacies of the Bauruco insurgencies. The linkages to the world outside the Monte would have been reinforced by waves of collectively self-emancipated individuals who appeared to have joined Enriquillo during these years. And then there were Maroons who, like the unidentified runaways apprehended on São Tomé and sent to Lisbon, were recaptured by colonial expeditionary forces. there's evidence of one individual identified simply as an, quote, Indian man captured in the War of Bauruco, who was taken to Santo Domingo, where traffickers sold him to a merchant who transported him to Spain, where he was forced to serve in the household of a Portuguese merchant residing in Toledo. There's more to be said here in terms of telling diasporic histories of re-enslavement converging on the Iberian Peninsula during these years that we can talk more about maybe in the Q&A. With the cimarrones of Bauruco, as they came to be called at the time, continuing to grow in numbers into the early 1530s, the Spanish crown, no doubt pressured by merchants active in Santo Domingo, funded a particularly large expedition against them, outfitted by 200 soldiers and led by Francisco de Barrio Nuevo. By September of 1533, Barrio Nuevo wrote that his campaign had brokered a truce with Enriquillo that followed the outlines of the 1528 agreement that had been rebuffed. In effect, we see the splintering of the collective and an acceptance to collaborate with the counterinsurgent forces that had been organized against them. While part of the agreement involved the resettlement of Enriquillo's collective to a nearby town, it's worth noting that fugitive settlements in the Bauruco area and elsewhere in the western and northern parts of Hispaniola persisted, as this map that you're seeing here suggests. The capitulation, if we want to call it that, of the Taino cacique to the Spanish at this particular moment of 1533-34 may have had less to do with the effectiveness of colonial counterinsurgency and more with the circumstances around Enriquillo's own position of leadership in relation to the various fluid collectives consisting of indigenous, African, and mestizo individuals in and around Bauruco. That Enrique died from an unspecified illness a year after the agreement with the Spanish, and that he had drawn up a will prior to his death might be a hint that he was in poor health, or that his physical state may have been a consideration for him to work out an agreement with the Spanish. Regardless of the circumstances of this surrender, though, I just want to emphasize that it was not a generalized one, and that various other cimarrones remained at large, not just in Hispaniola, but in other parts of the greater Caribbean over the same years. So towards a conclusion here, I've pointed out these parallels between the two contexts of São Tomé and Hispaniola, but I want to take some time by way of conclusion to reflect on how these parallels actually emerge from a shared history. Mocambo and Enriquillo, and here I want to go back to the map that we kind of started with. Mocambo and Enriquillo and the hundreds of other runaways who were connected to them did not live and struggle in a vacuum. The social, the political, the ecological transformations that they played a role in ushering into being were more expansive, open-ended, and indeed intertwined than colonial histories have tended to assume. One can make a case that individuals of different social standing, including some enslaved people, were informed of simultaneous fugitive developments on both sides of the ocean. Consider that in the early 1530s, several European-backed slaving voyages made the ocean crossing from São Tomé to the Caribbean and returned to the Gulf of Guinea with Antillean maize to supply future human trafficking ventures back to the Caribbean. In previous years, these same vessels had simply stocked their ships with foodstuffs bought on São Tomé proper. But recall that there was a provisioning crisis on São Tomé during the years of Mocambo's uprising, and that this crisis had been identified by many colonists as one of the causes behind the increase in runaways. So if word of the need for supplementing shipboard victuals had arrived in the Caribbean, especially among people directly responsible for conducting the transatlantic slave trade, talk of the insurgencies likely followed closely behind. Taking into account also that wealthy merchants in Lisbon who testified about the rise of Mocambo and complained of the ineffectual nature of colonial responses in the 30s, had numerous trading partners in Seville and Santo Domingo with whom they coordinated the forced transportations of hundreds of Africans in these years as they invested in sugar plantations. So it starts to become clear that not exchanging news about the insurgencies would have been a strange omission. Beyond the circulation of knowledge around marronage on São Tomé among mariners and elites, We can think back to the runaways who were re-enslaved in the Caribbean or São Tomé and exiled to Iberia, where if they survived, they would have lived with an understanding of unfolding insurgencies on distant islands and perhaps spoken to others about them. And it's exactly because of the pervasive nature of marronage that it's reasonable to assume that a significant number of people who were enslaved on São Tomé and survived the Middle Passage to arrive in the Caribbean would perceive the events taking place around Bauruco in light of the insurgencies that they had known in the Gulf of Guinea. Perhaps seeing some of the same dynamics of runaway ecologies at play would have factored into their calculations over joining the insurgencies themselves. It was precisely this scenario that authorities in nearby Puerto Rico in 1534 sought to curb when, in requesting a license from the Spanish crown to transport upwards of 1,000 enslaved Africans to jumpstart the island's transition to sugar plantation agriculture, they asked that none of the enslaved be brought from São Tomé. This is a hint that the accumulated weight of endemic fugitive enterprises on both sides of the ocean was having an effect not just on counterinsurgency measures, but on the architecture of enslavement and ultimately the shaping of nascent colonial institutions of governance. Here I want to close with these bigger considerations. These insurgencies came at the cusp of a critical historical inflection point that I explore further in my book project, a moment in the mid-16th century when Portuguese and Spanish administrators, merchants, and colonial officials in loosely concerted ways attempted to enact bold, sweeping reforms relating to mobility, slavery, and agrarian law. Striking a new posture of governance and profit-seeking, Iberian ruling elites by the mid-16th century became increasingly committed to an expansive imperial project that simultaneously subordinated nature and dispossessed peoples for purposes of sustained power and profit. Attending to the historicity of runaway ecologies allows us a vantage point onto a gradual crystallization of a colonial elite ideology behind these reforms, and the animating set of dispositions at their core that we associate today with white supremacy and racial capitalism. Notably, the history of runaway ecologies that I offered here suggests that a hardening colonial posture of sustained domination was a product and not a cause of ongoing social and environmental processes in the early Atlantic. Though merchants and officials by the mid-16th century increasingly supported the growth of the transatlantic slave trade, increased their investments in infrastructures of extraction and plantation production, and implemented measures for regulating transoceanic mobility, new generations of insurgents built on the traditions established by Mocambo and Enriquillo and the scores of men and women who engaged in struggle alongside them. Insurgents, runaways, and renegades from the high seas to the montes and matos continued in the mid-16th century and beyond to seek sustenance and power from unfolding dynamic ecologies, even after ruling elites began to believe with more fervent conviction that only they could or should. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel, for that amazing talk. And there's so much here. So first off, I want to invite everybody, if you want to join, turn on your cameras, turn on your mics. We've got time for a conversation. Yes, first off, a round of applause. That was a fantastic talk. If you want to just raise your hand if you have questions, we can start going from there. And while you're gathering your thoughts, I had a question more about kind of the process of doing this work in a pandemic, because I think you brought together so many like fantastic primary sources, but how's it been working on this project kind of since we've been in lockdown?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's at the, especially for a project that sort of casts its net wide in terms of the types of manuscript sources that I work with. It has been a challenge for sure. I think that one way that I've been really lucky is that the archives in Portugal and Spain, that have holdings relating to early colonial histories, have a substantial amount of their records online. And it's one thing to just know that, but it's another thing to have worked in those archives previously in person and have learned how they function, and on the basis of that, knowing how to navigate them online. And that's something that I think we don't often talk about enough amongst historians and other disciplines, is that it's great to have online archival material online, but you need time in those archives in order to even know how to really access that, or have like the knowledge that somebody can offer that who has worked there to sort of guide you. And so when in relation to the São Tomé material, there is a series of documents in the Lisbon archive in Torre do Tombo that has been digitized for a long time, actually, because it was put together. It was a series of documents that was put together after the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, and they were arranged chronologically. It's called the Corpo Cronológico, and then those records were microfilmed, and on the basis of the microfilm put online. And so I had always wanted to kind of sit down with those records and kind of systematically work through them. And actually this was the past year, I've had the chance to really kind of sit with them systematically, because when I do go to work in that archive in person, I'm trying to find things that haven't been digitized, right? So there was, similarly with the Spanish archives, I could kind of be more systematic about working with what has been digitized. But again, like it wouldn't have been possible without having worked there before. And so that's a real challenge for like training of new scholars who are eager to work with those archives now.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of, right, it's not just about access, but having sort of the literacy to actually navigate these materials and use these resources. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I want to say, like, if this is, in some ways, it's like one of the most concrete skills I feel like I've gotten through this work, and it's something that I'm very sort of passionate about, kind of sharing with other people knowledge, like how to read these documents, how to sort of think through them with them, and that's something that I really invite anyone here who wants to work more with these types of documents to reach out, and I'd be happy to kind of put together a working group even on like paleography and things like that.
Fantastic. All right, so do we have questions? I have Ayana.
Thank you so much for that brilliant talk. I couldn't take notes fast enough. So I guess I wanted do you have a publisher for your book? And if so, let us know so that we can pre-order. Are you under contract with someone?
Yes, I have a contract with the University of Pennsylvania Press.
So very good. Yay.
Working with them, yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Can you talk more about the ecological bits? Because I was really interested in the hogs, the feral hogs, cattle, and then yams you'd mentioned at one point. Just the way that, since you were thinking about things as ecologies in terms of like mutual influence, right? That it's not a one-way influence. And so I was wondering if you could just explain more about how, kind of ecologically in terms of animals and plants, things were affecting, both sides, the marronage and the kind of plantation slave owning populations.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, thanks for letting me kind of talk through a little bit more of that. And this is something that I'm still kind of working with in the manuscript. So I'm, these are thoughts in progress still. I'm trying to gather, as much scholarship that I can find on zooarchaeology in order to kind of make those links stronger between what I find are glimpses of, non-human animals in manuscript sources, and tying them to kind of material processes that archaeologists and other scholars have worked with. So I think that one of the things that is interesting is that, what I'm trying to do with the Runaway Ecologies concept is that I've been interested in kind of thinking about how even in the sort of categories that of how we understand, for instance, how we talk about invasive species, right? The very notion that the ecological processes that ensue from the introduction of particular species in an environment are seen to be invasive, right? Using a kind of colonial language to express the fallout of that is already kind of pushing us to measure whatever happens in relation to the amassing of power by the invaders, right? And I think that's what Crosby's Colombian exchange really kind of sets us up to think about. And what the sources suggest, there are references, particularly for Saint Thomé, of the shifting of the sort of resurgence of the mato when left to its own devices, right? When people haven't been cultivating agricultural plots and things like that, which is curious because we know that there was a proliferation of hogs on the island during that period. And there's a dynamic there where, the hogs are a basis for subsistence for both people on the run and for established colonial settlements. And so there's a sort of attrition, in terms of through the hunting of hogs. There's this attenuation of the potential ecological, destructive impact of the presence of hogs in those environments. And then, and so sometimes, when I'm finding evidence of colonial sources saying, oh, well, those agricultural fields haven't been cultivated and are, the mato has taken them over again, in part because we are concerned about attacks from Mocambo and other fugitives. The fact that they are noticing regrowth in those areas suggests that actually, people were pretty systematically hunting down these feral hogs, right? So that's one kind of potential way of interpreting that. But I'm still kind of thinking through that. It's a tough sort of dynamic to get at. There's more that can be said, I think, about how people understood the process of sort of, if we want to call it ferality, right, in the late medieval, early modern period. There are references to wild livestock, right? For Saint Thomé, when they're talking about wild, they refer to gado bravo in the 1490s. When we know that there hadn't been livestock prior to their introduction by the Portuguese in the 1470s and 80s. So they're necessarily talking about feral creatures. But there's a longer story, and I've written about this in an essay before about the use of in the Spanish Caribbean, the emergence of a vocabulary around ferality that draws from cimarron, the term for maroons, and applies it to feral creatures. And oftentimes that's, scholars will point to that as kind of the origins of the term. But in my research, I've found that actually that happens, that the uses of cimarron to refer to feral creatures in the Spanish Caribbean actually comes in the later mid 16th century. So initially it's referring to people, specifically indios, and later negros, and then later to animals. And so there's I think a history there about the power of insurgency and the claims that fugitives had on cattle and livestock that were ranging across the island and that were important to their subsistence, right? So those are kind of different ways that I get at that question, but there's a lot more to think through, and a really interdisciplinary approach, I think, is key, that draws from not just archaeology, biogeography, but also linguistics and historical documents.
Thank you so much. An incredibly generous answer, and also, pointing to where we can go in the future. So thank you.
It looks like we got a couple questions in the chat. Do those people want to ask those questions? I can ask them. Holly, Robin. Holly? All right. Calling on you, Holly.
I think Robin's question was first. Do you want to
Okay.
jump in?
Again,
I'll go if not.
Okay, thanks for your wonderful talk, Gabriel. I wonder if you'd use the First Africans materials from the Dominican Studies Institute. Are they relevant to your work on cimarrones and fugitive ecologies?
Yes, yeah, thank you for that. This is a great website and sort of research initiative put together out of CUNY. And they draw from so they offer, speaking about like paleography work and training and stuff like that. I think that the name of the address of the website is firstblacks.org, and I've used it in teaching actually quite a lot, and it's great for it provides really important primary source material for the early colonial history of Santo Domingo. And it has images of documents, it has transcriptions in Spanish and translations into English. So really fantastic and explanatory material to buttress understanding of those documents. I have drawn, because I'm sort of drawing from the same archives that this website has put together. And but I do kind of peruse their holdings or their exhibition material to sort of orient myself sometimes, and some of the material that's there relating to the 1521-22 insurgency on Santo Domingo, that's considered to be the first uprising or one of the earliest uprisings in America led by African people. It has a lot of the material related to that, and so it can kind of offer for folks who are interested important kind of points of entry into the larger archive. That particular insurgency is really interesting because it's contemporaneous with the Enriquillo insurgency, and so it kind of gives us a sense of really how there were multiple fugitive groups that were sometimes coalescing, sometimes in tension with each other, and we have to sort of reckon with that, right? Like just because you were a fugitive, whether in Santo Domingo or in São Tomé, it did not mean that you were allied to other fugitives, and so there's sometimes I think we are quick to assume that there was a natural alliance between those groups, but sometimes there's some evidence to suggest that they were in tension with each other. I don't, in this case, it's more like we have to think about the concurrence of these different insurgencies. So yeah, so it's a great resource, and I really recommend that folks check it out.
So I might have Holly ask, I know we're at 2 o'clock, her question, that'd be our last question, unfortunately, but because this was so fascinating, I feel like we could talk about this forever, but Holly.
Oh, thank you. What a wonderful talk and what a rich framework. And I'm really thinking through how mobile it is. And so I want to apologize in advance for the myopic nature of my question, which has to do with my own research. But I'm obsessed with Renaissance gorillas. And I've been thinking a lot about how a runaway ecology emerges in a primary source that I think a lot about, which is The Strange Adventures of Andrew Battle, who you may not be familiar with, or you might be familiar with, but who is a little bit later than your time period. He's an English sailor who does a kind of reverse migration, but still dealing with the same framework that you're moving in. That is, he moves from Brazil and then sold into slavery by the Portuguese and moves into Africa and becomes a primary source, supposedly, about what he calls the Jaga or the Mbangala. And so for me, one of the things I find really fascinating about it is it seems as though what are the role of the English in these sources and how are they learning from these runaway ecologies and applying them and appropriating them in really troubling ways. And I think we see this with Battle in his primary source, where he is both enslaved and then becomes someone who enslaves others. He takes 2 African boys back with him purportedly to England. And these African boys have the knowledge of the gorillas, which is why I'm obsessed with this narrative. But then it also seems to mirror in some ways John Smith and how he works with and thinks about ecologies as and specifically ecologies of insurgency in order to master them and then apply them in colonial settings. So I'm curious if any of this is applicable, or if I'm just wildly distorting how your framework might be applied in other historical moments. Thank you so much.
Thank you. No, that's great. And I'm really grateful to you for mentioning that, what sounds like a fascinating source. I haven't come across it, so I will definitely check it out. You know, I think that, you know, I've sort of focused on this colonial Iberian space, but I think you're right to point out that, you know, that there's a lot of potential for maybe even sort of interrogating the linguistic boundaries and sort of the imperial and colonial boundaries that historians and other scholars tend to apply for understanding the Atlantic. And particularly because, you know, if we think about the sort of centripetal aspect of runaway ecologies, and there's just this sort of the profuse nature of it that involves not just the movement of people, but of non-human creatures, right? Then the sort of traditional colonial boundaries stop making that much sense. And actually, the runaway ecologies concept itself sort of helps us to bust open some of those boundaries. So specifically in relation to like the presence of the English or the French in even this early Atlantic moment, one of the bases of the sort of arrival of the concerted arrival of French and later English and even Portuguese mariners and merchants in the Caribbean involves contraband, right? And this is all well known, with in many cases with maroons over the trade in leather and other goods. And so you see that like the proliferation of feral creatures, right, in places like Hispaniola offers sustenance for fugitives in some cases, right? Meat from feral cattle, but also the possibility of, you know, hide work and treating the hides and selling them and turning them into leather and selling them to and this is to French, Portuguese, English merchants and mariners in the later 16th century. And you have references to whole areas in you know, the north coast of Hispaniola, for instance, that's known as a site of contraband trade between where the Portuguese and the French and the English come to trade with maroons. So there's the very nature of runaway ecologies allows for these sort of transgressions of imperial and colonial boundaries. And I think that that's applicable to other kind of the understanding the creation of frontier zones to begin with. It's not a coincidence that Bauruco is towards the frontier between what's today the Dominican Republic and Haiti, right? So again, like I think that I hope that this offers folks stuff to work with, and I'd be delighted to kind of continue these conversations and learn from others, you know, how they might apply it to their work, and keeping these collaborations going, keeping this residency even more flexible into the future. So again, I really appreciate everybody sticking to the Zoom and talking a little bit today, and look forward to talking some more down the road. Cool.
And I just, Gabrielle, I just want to say thank you again for such a fascinating talk. And I'm glad that we were finally able to make it happen only 8-ish months after we had originally planned. So thank you again. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. I know we didn't have time to get all the questions that there were, but we really appreciate you joining us. So thanks. And we hope to see you in January for Race Before Race education.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody. Take care.